baby, bye, bye, bye.
This is Anne and the narrator. The narrator and Anne share an apartment. One day, Anne, her boyfriend Teddy, and Eugene, one of their friends, went on a trip to the countryside. Well, once they were there, Eugene Trask killed Teddy, Anne's boyfriend, and then drove off with Anne. Then, once he tried to make advances on her, she tried to hit him. It didn't succeed. He got angry, and so he killed her the same way that he killed Teddy. Then he tossed her body into an abandoned mine shaft. And so then the narrator, the girl back at home, was very worried because she was missing, la 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 la. And so then she goes to a psychic, and the psychic says, oh, she is in a dark place. And so this is the present day where she is questioning death, etc.
This short story is in first person and switches between the past and present tenses. And just like the heart, as Bloom states, there are 4 parts, and each part represents a different stage of grief. The first, denial; the second, anger; the third, bargaining; and the fourth, acceptance.
We'll begin with the first stage of grief, denial. This short story shows many different ways of dealing with grief. For example, Mrs. Warburg, Anne's mother, is completely inconsolable and dies alone with a cigarette on her lips and alcohol in her hands. The narrator likes to sit on Anne's bed with her bathrobe and a glass of wine, and also Mr. Warburg is a complete alcoholic, and it just shows the different ways of dealing with grief. Mrs. Warburg and the narrator connect, while Mr. Warburg and Mrs. Warburg disconnect, add walls, etc. As Mrs. Warburg stated, there is roof mold and crack in the foundation of her house. This is representative of Mr. and Mrs. Warburg's relationship.
Also, something interesting is that the psychic that the narrator goes to has found something precious before. It is specifically mentioned, a diamond ring. And so there is this constant comparison of Anne to jewels and precious minerals. Anne was a diamond in the rough for the narrator. And also, the psychic lived on Beacon Hill, which could be a symbol of the narrator's last beacon of hope.
The narrator and Mrs. Warburg are constantly talking about Anne, and they're talking about, oh, we love glamorous. It's present tense, even though there's not much hope left that she's still alive. And when the narrator imagines a funeral scene, she imagines that Teddy's dead and Anne's standing right next to his grave, because she tries to think that since Teddy's dead, then Anne must be alive. She must have escaped, and she's just in denial. Also present in the short story is the contrast between nature's perfection and humanity's scars. This contrast supports the claim that justice is not always served to human satisfaction. The death of the young especially, who used to have bright futures ahead of them, when they die, is there any justice in that? Is death just arbitrary? The narrator questions this throughout the entire story. Okay, also, Bloom says the left side of the heart pumped blood, while the right sits as still as a cave. This may in fact be a metaphor for the relationship between the narrator and Anne, because Anne was thrown down a cave, she's silent, she's still, but the narrator is the left side of the heart, and she's constantly pumping. She has to keep going. She can't stop even when there is so little hope left.
There's also a lot of anger in this section. This is the description of the murder. And although it may seem like an objective recount of events, it's actually filled with sarcasm and very bitter diction. When Eugene killed Emmett, the narrator says that he killed him next to the sign that said, "No hunting, no drinking," but it didn't say no killing.
This next section is filled with bargaining, or it's a confrontation of feelings. The police officers are interrogating her about her relationship with Anne and her relationship with Teddy, and actually it's almost like she's having a battle within herself. There's no dialogue during the police scene. It's almost like it's just thoughts. There are no quotation marks. And this section supports the idea that maybe everybody wants a juicy story, but real life is full of mundane truths. The narrator, if she had any romantic feelings for Anne, likely did not express her sentiments before she died. And this has probably led to the conflict of emotions. The romantic feelings theory would be supported by the fact that she's lying in Anne's bed, and the fact that she would carry Anne home from the mine, and the fact that she was, quote, an idiot from birth, and that is why she said a lot of things that sounded like lies, end quote. Perhaps lies to herself. And also, there is a confrontation of feelings about death. The narrator contemplates what the psychic told her. It's very dark where she is. The narrator feels like death shouldn't affect her because she's young and innocent and shiny and bright like the jewel that the psychic found. The darkness shouldn't hurt her, but it did, and this leads her to question the nature of death. The last section of the short story is about acceptance, the last stage of grief, and this section takes place many years into the future when the narrator is looking back on these events. And she talks about death. She says that there are contrasts between light and dark, and this reflects the claim that death is almost beyond human understanding as, quote, the iris, the rainbow of the eye, closes down, end quote. All hope is lost in that moment of despair, and so to avoid confronting our fears of death, we close the door to the other person's soul. Later, however, at the end of the short story, the narrator claims that Anne's eyes were open and blue when she was found in the mine after she was dead. This represents the narrator's acceptance of death and ultimately the impact it has on the lives of the survivors.
In fact, there is a metaphor for the survivors, and it is, quote, they lay fly eggs, and ants come, draw to the eggs, and sometimes wasps and always maggots, beetles and moths, the household kind that eat your sweaters, finish the body, they undress the flesh and the bone, they are the cleanup crew, end quote. This implies that humans screw up their lives so badly that if we let our skeletons out of the closet, the people are going to know and see us differently. This is just the point when the narrator says,
Let it go, let it go.
The repetition of the cave likely comes from Anne's death, but may also allude to Plato's cave, where people don't understand the world around them until they are enlightened. In this case, through the death of Anne, the narrator's eyes are open to the world of death and the impact it has on those who survive it. Codependency, survivor's guilt, anger that feelings weren't expressed in time, etc. There's also discussion of justice. Even though Eugene was shot and killed, along with his sister and her children, there is no gratification for the narrator, even though, quote, Mrs. Warburg sent her the clipping, quote, for each event, the repetition shows the unforgiving nature of the narrator for the crimes of the dead. The narrator believes Eugene Trask to be the completely dark antagonist with little motive other than the fact that his childhood sucked. For the narrator, Eugene is almost a personification of death. For this reason, the narrator blames the death of her father on people like him, those that take life from those who have so much left to live for. Everyone dies of heart failure, Eugene says. Well, maybe it's true. Everyone dies of heartache from the emotional violence we scar ourselves with. That's why there is a cleanup crew. Ultimately, the narrator misses innocence. She misses going through the fields. She misses the indents of the bucket on her finger when she milks the cow. But through escaping the cave, she's become enlightened, and nothing can be the same again. Through death, there is significance to life. Through death, the weight of life becomes precious, just as Anne was to the narrator.
I wanna see you out that door, baby, bye-bye.